Welcome to the Primate Talk Podcast. Here we have nuanced interactions with interesting folks undertaking unconventional endeavors and see the world through eyes that are not just our own. In the latest episode of the Primate Talk Podcast, I talk with one of the most profound people I've had the chance to meet. Say hello to Abhishek Shetty. Abhishek is a school teacher and an educational researcher. He has 9 years of experience working as an educator and researcher for organizations like the American School of Bombay, Consilience Education Foundation, and the Western University. He is currently an elementary school teacher at Lindrose Heights in Ontario, Canada. In his free time, he writes an educational newsletter called The Education Coffee and run an interview podcast and video show called Learning Stories. His career objective is to add value as an educational professional through his capacity as a teacher, researcher, and an educator. Abhishek's profundity in the matters of education and learning struck me as something to gain inspiration off of. I learned a lot from him, while he turned our conversation into an edited discussion. This talk mainly looks at learning and why we learn as human beings. As we build a case for learning, we slowly slip into the nitty-gritties of the education system and the latest research and innovation in the same to carve out well-rounded individuals rather than producing resources on a massive scale. So, tune into this profound discussion with Abhishek and learn more about him in the process while he makes a compelling case for learning as a skill in this class of life. Hello, Abhishek Shetty, fellow learner. Welcome to the Primate Talk Podcast. How does it feel to be on the other side for a change?
It's actually very interesting, Arundhati. I'm curious about where this will go, but I think I've listened to other episodes of the Primate Talks, and
Right.
I think you do a very good job, taking it where it will eventually end up. So I think the questions will lead to the answers, but for now I'm quite excited and nervous. So
Now, I want to make sure that you have a comfortable space. Don't worry, I'm not going to ask you anything
yeah.
that's intimidating or anything. I just want this to be a very good experience for you, and I'm really happy to have you here. I came to know about Abhishek from a mutual friend because both of us interviewed a mutual friend of ours called Sandesh Kini, and that's when I came to know about his Abhishek's podcast. Learning stories, and I couldn't stop myself. I couldn't hit the pause button because it was so interesting the way you carried the conversation. There was so much clarity in in the way you spoke, and that is what struck me as something very important, because what we see with people often is trying to rush their conversations, and either with the fear of being stopped or being interrupted and not being able to speak or express themselves properly. And I felt that in your podcast, the way even the way you structure the entire conversations and the kind of atmosphere that you provide for those people is something that helps them, or helps them express themselves in a very beautiful way and gets the good, the qualities that they're really invited for in the podcast. So I was like, I have to get Abhishek on the podcast because I'd like to you know pick his brains on learning, because learning was something that I was fascinated about too for such a long time. Ever since college, I was just seeing a lot of people coming in and seeing a lot of people with diverse skills and backgrounds. I was like, how do they do this? I'm just fascinated with how people pick up things. And when I saw that your entire your career is based on learning, and you speak about learning a lot, how people learn, why they learn, what are the motivations, I wanted to dig in more into that and uncover that with you. So welcome to the show, and let's start. So Abhishek, I want to start with your story, the one that you narrated in one of your talks that you gave on Consilience Learning's YouTube channel. You mentioned that in the earlier days of your student life, you were not what you'd call a performer in your class. You always wanted to know about what made students perform well, but you couldn't get yourself to do that somehow. Enters this girl into the scene, one of the toppers in your class, with a checklist of external determinants, being like, Abhishek, I got this. Here's what you need to do. You have to be good at time management. You have to complete all your assignments on time. You have to complete your seat time requirements, prepare a transcript, memorize that transcript. And this actually worked for you. You had managed to secure a seat among the elite performers and were one of the poster boys, pun intended, of the education system.
Yeah.
But and I know there was a but coming, because I was like, this video doesn't have a point if there's no but.
Yeah.
But soon enough, you realize that you knew of no effective way to implement or to practically work in the real world, which is much messier than our textbooks show us. So having that epiphany, you took a gap year and you realize a lot of things then, so to speak, about the experience. So I'd like to know more about that experience that you had in that 1 year. And you
Sure.
structured it in 6 months. You bifurcated it, and I'd like to get into more depths of that experience that you had in that 1 year and how that led you to where you are today, or made a positive impact on your life. On to you.
Sure. Sure, Arundhati. I mean, that's a great question. It makes me think about everything. I think it's been such a long time since
Uh-huh.
that happened. But like, just to, backtrack a little bit to lead up to the gap here, like going back to what you shared about my experience in school. And that's something, if you think about it, Arundhati, all of us have been students in schools, in classrooms. So in a way, all of us have 10 to 12 years of experience watching teachers teach.
Mm.
So if you think about it, we're all sort of, we have some idea of what um, education and learning is because of our own experience in the classroom. And I grew up in the Middle East, and um, my parents, just like any other set of Indian South Asian parents, very ambitious and hopeful for their kids. So um, the objective was, you have to study really hard to get a good job and get into a good university. So that was the narrative that was constantly given to me growing up. So very early on, in grade 8 or grade 9, I was put into like this prep academy to get into like a very good engineering institute, and it was like a very popular training academy, and it was in grade 8, so I was quite young. And I think that experience was very. I think it had like a huge impact on me because I was quite lost in that classroom. In grade 8, you're just figuring
Mm.
yourself out, and you're not really sure about what's happening. So for some reason, I didn't know why I was learning physics, chemistry, biology, and the focus was always to do well in the tests and not to understand why these subjects were, really interesting. So I got really scared of physics, chem, biology, and what I decided to do was to find a path that's completely divergent from it. Because I thought this was not my thing. Because I associated my sense of understanding with how well I did on the test, rather
Uh-huh.
than how physics, chem, or biology, or math, or English, or any other subject can help you understand the world better,
Mm. Mm.
right? So most of my high school, was this constant struggle to sort of find a subject that really I connect with.
Mm.
And I think so from science I jumped into commerce. From commerce I jumped into like a media program. So after I finished high school, for a year I did like journalism and advertising because I thought that was my thing. But then at some point in college I realized that I'm just trying to achieve a goal with no particular purpose. I'm just trying to finish milestones rather than really do
Mm.
this for a purpose.
Mm.
Because Arundhati, and we never really get a chance to think about why we're doing what we're doing, right?
Yeah.
Because there's so much pressure on just getting through these milestones, get through high school, get through university, get a good job, get married. Nobody, I mean, it's important to, I never gave myself a chance to ask myself, how are the things you're doing related to who you are as an individual, right? So in after my first year of university, I studied at a media school in Mumbai. I just said I want to take like a gap year, right? I want to take a gap year to sort of figure out what I'm passionate about, what I'm interested in. And like I had a plan for the gap year, because when I was in university and when I was in high school, so my last year of high school was actually like an experiment, like a learning experiment,
Mm.
and you mentioned the story of the other student that did really well.
Mm.
So I said, you know what, I'm gonna emulate what the good students in my school are doing and see if I can get really good grades. So I did the exact same thing and I got really good grades. And I wrote a book about it called Academic Excellence.
Mm-hmm.
And it was basically a conversation between my grade 12 persona and my grade 10 persona. And, we sort of tried to understand why we did certain things and how
Mm-hmm.
we did them. So in the gap year, I basically said, I'm going to do two things. For 6 months, I am going to try and understand what learning is, go on these different learning experiments and just figure out and have fun with learning, and also figure out what I want to do with my life going ahead. So I
Mm-hmm.
think I was 20 or 21, and this was the first time in my life where, learning didn't have a particular purpose or like a particular direction. So I thought for 6 months I'm going to do that. And I'm also going to do these, workshops and seminars at schools, just talk to kids, because I was interested in the education system as well. And that's where my passion for research and, education started. So I was just doing these workshops for kids about why it's important to think about what you're doing. Very, very, basic stuff. But it was just a reason I wanted to get into the schools, and that was the only way to do it. So that's what I did for 6 months. And for 6 months, I went backpacking like around India. And so that was the plan. It was in 2013 or 2014. And so yeah, that's the story of how I jumped into the gap year, and why that was important. But I can tell you more about what happened in that gap year now. But I felt like this was important to just, because I don't think too many people would know about where I'm coming from. So I just thought I'd answer this question. I'm so sorry if I digressed a
No, not
little.
a problem, because this is exactly what I want to get into, what you did in that gap year, what all
Yeah.
those things that you did. But just to go back onto the point when you said that, you were doing physics, chemistry, and bio, and all those subjects you were taking up, and you weren't really able to relate it with the real world somehow. You just were focused on, or so you were conditioned to focus on, getting the external variables right, like your marks and your
Yeah.
everything else, right? So was there at that particular time, apart from these subjects, was there something else that you were interested in, and you felt that you were doing really well in, but you couldn't find a way to put that across to people or make it seem important? Maybe, like, you were good at art, just as an example, but these things are not graded. All those extracurricular things that you do and you were interested in, maybe you were
Mm.
good at football. So all these things that you were good at, you found your flow in, your zen
Mm.
mode in. Was there anything like that which helped which made you feel so much better about yourself, and you felt like you were doing something different there? But just because these weren't graded, or these weren't, all these things were not out there, you couldn't really focus on them as much. So
Yeah. That's interesting, because I like, one thing I can actually share is my passion for reading, like
haha.
till like grade 8 or grade 9, I was not too much of a reader. And it's weird that I say this because we read so many different things, right?
Mm,
But I mean, I would read school textbooks and stuff, but not as much beyond that. But
mhm,
I remember I was very passionate about sports, and I used to
mm,
play cricket and table tennis, and at the
mm,
school level, and in Bahrain we used to play for the cricket team over there, which is a very small country, so everyone gets a
mm,
chance to do that. But for the I never thought you could read books about things you are interested in.
mm,
I thought you only had to read difficult books growing up, which is the notion that you get. The only books you need to read are great literature, very complex scientific books. And when you start off reading books that are not at your reading level, or at your level of understanding, you can again cut yourself off from that sort of task. And
mm,
that's why I was never a reader, because I was always given books that were way above my current capacity, or
mm,
about topics or themes I had no clue about.
mm, mm,
But there was one teacher, okay, she realized I liked sports
mm.
or something about sports. So she gave me a book about a cricketer. It was like a biography about, I think, Sunil Gavaskar. It was
Ah,
Sunny Days or
uh-huh.
something.
Yeah. Mm,
And I loved cricket. And I read the book in like, I think like a week or so. And
mm,
it was like
mm,
this really, like pretty big book. I think it was
mm,
like 300, 400 pages.
mm,
And I was like, wow. So I am a reader. I just had to read a book about something I was interested in. And then my sister gave me this book called Born to Run. And It was about this tribe in Mexico that was really passionate about long distance running. Okay,
Oh.
and they were called the Tarahumurans. And there is this race called the Ultra Marathon, which is like
Mm-hmm.
4 marathons combined.
Mm-hmm.
And the book was about how the people from this tribe were really good in that race without
Oh,
any additional training,
right.
because for them, running was not a competition, it was sort of a way of life.
Oh.
And
Uh-huh.
I read that book and I'm like, wow, I mean, this is amazing, and that's when I realized that I need to find my own path through this journey of books. So I made a list of every single book related to sports I could find, and I started reading everything. And there was another theme I was very interested in. I think it was fantasy, and I was in grade 10 or grade 11. So I read every single like fantasy, like, the
Mm-hmm.
Harry Potter, the
Mm-hmm.
Percy Jackson series. And slowly my interest in reading started developing, and then I had this whole self-help phase, and then I started reading nonfiction and then fiction and then poetry and drama. Eventually, after the gap year, I got so interested and passionate about reading that I decided to do a BA in English literature, which was like
Uh-huh.
my undergraduate degree. So
Right.
I mean, that the my passion for reading is just one story that I felt, was developed in this alternate sort of manner. But and I wish I got the encouragement from school to pick up some
Mm-hmm.
of these books, but unfortunately I didn't. And I don't think it's the fault of the teachers
Mm-hmm.
or the system in general. I just feel like, it's important to have that conversation with somebody when they're
Right.
quite young, right? And I
Uh-huh.
fortunately I had my sister and some other individual in my life, but yeah.
It's not a good thing that, I sometimes look at it and it feels like we spent so many years in schools and educational systems in the institutions, and, only to find out that all these skills that we, or all these skills that we acquired were not really, are actually redundant, and they're no longer, basically they're just obsolete in the real world. And,
Mm,
I also feel like, you can correct me if I'm wrong, but the education system it works in a very standardized way. And if a
mm,
bunch of students can figure that standard out, like, how your friend just meted out the whole checklist and, convinced you to follow it, and you also, got good at it, these people are rewarded. Those bunch of students who can figure that out and who can work their ass off to, be able to check that list off, they are rewarded for it, and others are made to feel bad about themselves. And I think you've covered this in this book that you authored called Competence, which
mm,
basically talks about competence based learning. And the central questions you address in the book are: how would you design a learning process to help each of the student develop the specific competencies they eventually develop during their lives? And more importantly, how do we support the students in our classrooms today to pursue and develop the competencies they want and need in their lives, which is
mm,
basic, it goes to your point. And this really helps in designing an education program or platform that caters more to the individual competencies of students,
mm,
and not only following that standardized way, which basically tells either you follow that or not. Whenever parents go to their parents teachers meetings, their teachers are like, oh, these people are performing well, then what is the problem with your kid? And
mm,
this is one thing that I was talking with one of my friends. She used to live in Dubai back then, and she was narrating how all the students were observed, and they were categorized into either visual learners, auditory learners, or kinesthetic learners. So
mm,
for those people who do not have any idea of what these are, visual learners work more on visual, based on graphs and all those things, with like visual things. And auditory learners are much better listeners, and kinesthetic learners are who, actually work with, who have to experience, in order to learn that, experience the situation in order to learn from that. So based on that, they will figure out how the program can be catered to their learning needs, to the children's
mm,
learning needs. So I'd like to know a little about some of the innovative ways the education system is working on or researching on to facilitate children who aren't able to
mm,
perform. You mentioned you visited and studied this about this innovative learning spaces and institutions across the country to collect data and stories on progressive learning methodologies. You
mm,
interacted with over 20,000 students, and in 120 schools in 15 cities in a year.
Mhm.
So I'd like to know what you discovered there. Like, how are we progressing? Because back in my day, the education system was shitty. Sorry to for the lack of a better word, but how has this progressed over these years? If you could shed some light on those methodologies, those innovative methodologies that are being uh, experimented with, or implemented in the education system.
Sure, sure, Arundhati. I mean, that's again, my knowledge about it is again
Mm.
limited to my experience in the
Right.
system,
Mm-hmm.
and I may not understand. I mean, education is such a huge, complex sort of subject, right?
Mm-hmm.
So
Mm-hmm.
I'm just providing you one piece of the puzzle. So that's like a disclaimer in the sense of
Uh-huh.
my
Right.
limited understanding
Mm-hmm.
of the field but like in terms of what I understand of it, like in India, if you think about it, there is the private system and the public system, right? And the ability to be innovative can be directly correlated to your access to resources,
Mm-hmm.
right? So often the private system is well funded in terms of uh, student capacity and the number of students in a class and the amount of attention you can give each child. And then the public system, again, it's much more widespread, but there may be, I mean, the amount of funding for additional training programs may be slightly limited, right? But again, it varies depending on state. For instance, if you're a public school in a more urban area, you probably have access to more funding than a public
Mm-hmm.
school in a semi-urban or rural area. So
Mm-hmm.
in India, a lot of us would have gone to one of these four schools. We would have gone to a state board school, a national board school, which can be either CBSE or ICSE, or one of the international boards, which are IB or IGCSE.
Mm-hmm.
So I mean, this is like a larger macro sort of understanding of the boards of education in India.
Mm-hmm.
Now, when I was like after I wrote that first book, Academic Excellence, I wanted to do something different. Again, I was quite young. I wasn't sure what I wanted to do with my life. So
Mm-hmm.
I just thought, doing like sessions with teachers and students would be one way for me to figure things out, right? So I would do this 1 hour session, and it was part of like a youth empowerment campaign. I don't know.
Yeah.
I mean, I don't relate to that particular individual I was at that point of time,
Mm-hmm.
but I think it's also part of you growing up and understanding what you want to do, right?
Mm-hmm.
So when I went to these schools, right, I think it was fascinating to see how every teacher at the end of the day, no matter what their situation, they want the best, in some way for their kids, right?
Mm-hmm.
So like if you think about strategies, like I remember reading about some schools that were implementing project-based learning,
Mm-hmm.
where students build projects to understand what they're learning conceptually in class, right? So I
Right.
thought that was
Uh-huh.
that was a very interesting and innovative method of learning
Uh-huh.
that that I think is very applicable in today's world. Like I remember, like later on, I got to work with a school that had this event called um, the Global Social Entrepreneurship Summit.
Mm-hmm.
So in this particular event, students will look at the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals, and then they would interact with a lot of social entrepreneurs, and then they would choose one particular social problem. And
Mm-hmm.
once they choose this problem, they would use the design thinking process
Mm-hmm.
to create a possible relevant local solution to that problem in their own context. So I was fortunate to be part of the team that ran this event for a couple of years, and it was actually designed by the research team at the American School of Bombay. And there's a individual who I think has influenced my thinking on education a lot. Her name was Dr. Shabi Luthra, and she was the tech lead and the research lead at the American School of Bombay. So she,
Mm-hmm.
I think, was part of the team that conceptualized this.
Mm-hmm.
But that was the first time I saw that you can mix project-based learning, design thinking, maker learning,
Mm-hmm.
and give students this real-world opportunity to apply their learning. And there were kids who were in grade 10 and grade 11, Arundhati, that were creating social enterprises, and
Wow.
they were like so passionate about solving real world problems. Like one
Mm-hmm.
kid realized that how do we reduce carbon emissions. so
Uh-huh.
so I think that group designed an application
Mm-hmm.
that tied like retail offers. Like if you use public transport, I will give you certain points that you can exchange for buying products at a reduced price.
Oh,
So
wow.
they basically were incentivizing people
Hmm.
to use more public
Right.
transport, which in turn reduced sort of carbon emissions because
Mm.
people use their own vehicles less. Or some other kids, were trying to um, they were really passionate about in-service learning for teachers in the
Mm-hmm.
public system because they felt that like that was not done as much.
Mm.
So I thought that was such an interesting way for kids to learn today, right? And I
Mm.
also feel like the internet changes things significantly,
Yeah,
right?
it does.
Because I think all of us, especially millennials that grew up, in the 90s and early 2000s, were accessing information so quickly, in so many different ways. Like for instance, both of us are so passionate about podcasts, and we learn so much through books, podcasts, movies, videos, YouTube talks, TED, I don't know, all these other platforms that, and I think it's important for the education system to also acknowledge that information is coming in from a variety of different
Sources.
streams.
Yeah.
So we're not the gatekeepers of information anymore. So we're trying to create a context that allows rich conversations around these information sort of
Mm-hmm.
overloads. So I think these were some ideas that I wanted to share about innovative strategies that I possibly saw in that phase.
Right.
But
Mm-hmm.
yeah.
No, that's really powerful. That's powerful to know, because that actually also incentivizes a culture of growth rather than
Mm,
just okay, you passed your 10th grade, you have your certificate now, please, okay, on to the next phase of your life. It's really powerful to know that. Uh, yeah. So okay, I want to go back now, in terms of building a case for learning. So
mhm,
in order to understand everything, I always tend to start with questioning its existence. Why is it required in the first place? What is the case for it from the point of survival? Because
mm,
here's what I've come to understand about human beings: if there's anything we've gotten good at, it's that we've gotten good at ensuring our survival. Now, in
mm,
that, there's two things: we got better at making things work in our favor, and then we graduated to making them in such a way that they work for us without
mm,
any constant stimulus. Think automation. Take the example of machine learning algorithms or self-driving cars. So
mm,
this is a very interesting evolution to look at. So there are certain factors that helped us reach the top of the food chain, or so to speak, and it has a lot to do with how we evolved. But I also want to understand the role of our ability to learn in reaching that point.
mm,
And that is the learning, and that is learning how to navigate our complex environments, learning how to combine different elements in different ways in order to make them work for our survival. So
mm,
likewise, allow us to touch the depths of the importance of learning in evolving our external environments to ensure that our survival is meted out.
mm.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, that's such a deep, question that can have so many different answers, and I think everyone will answer that differently, right? But
Mm-hmm.
like, I was having this conversation with a friend,
Uh-huh.
Arundhati, recently, and we were just thinking, like, if you think about all animals around us or any
Mm-hmm.
sort of living form, I mean, the incubation period is not very long, right?
Mm-hmm.
Sometimes animals they're born and then they decide to just lead their lives.
Right.
But for some reason, humans, we have this 18-year incubation period where, we're teaching these people in buildings how to do certain things. So, like, if you think about any other animal, they'll be looking at us and be like, you need to go out and, like, get some food or like figure things out. Why are you sitting and doing this? So, I mean, there must be some purpose to why this develops some sort of importance, right? And
Mm.
not just 18 years. Some of us eventually end up doing a PhD, and, so we're in a classroom for about 30 years of our life, right?
They
So,
tend to extend the incubation period on our
correct.
own
And
command. Yeah.
true, and that's a big chunk of our lives, right?
Mm-hmm.
30, 32 years, I don't know, 25, some people get it much
Yeah.
earlier. But we keep, again, but it doesn't stop there, right,
Mm-hmm.
Arundhati? Even in our workplaces, we have to keep learning, right? Especially now with automation and AI.
Yes.
If you're not updating your skills in any field, I think you see that in programming in particular, because
Yes.
languages are constantly changing, right? So because you'd understand this better as a technology consultant. You need to stay up to date with
Yeah.
updates to languages, to new forms of doing things. I think that's valid in any field. We are
Mm-hmm.
learning throughout our lives. But when I was like working with the team at the American School of Bombay, um, I was very interested in who designed, this structure in the first place. So why do
Mhm.
we go to university for 4 years and then
Right.
do our masters for 2 years
Hmm.
and then do a PhD for 4 to 5 years? I
Mhm.
mean, why should it be 4 years? Why should it be 2 years? And why school for 12 years?
Mhm.
Can we do it like a little quicker? Or like, why can we do it for a little longer? So I remember reading like there was this book I read. He was like this guy called Clark Kerr. Okay, he
Uh-huh.
was like the chancellor of the University of the Berkeley, and he
Mhm.
used to give these lectures in the '60s about the uses of the university. And
Mhm.
in that book, I was, because this is something I do in my free time a lot. I just read random books about education policy, about education. So that's like my sort of nerding out sort of phase. But
Mhm. Mhm.
in that book he talked about uh, the first universities that were ever created. Okay,
Mhm.
these universities were not created to just give out degrees. Okay, there
Uh-huh.
were people that were very good at a particular skill.
Right.
So
Mm.
there was people that were very good at theology, or there were
Okay.
people that were very good at carpentry.
Mm.
So they realized that we have a skill that is valued by society. So
Mm.
we need to find a way to transfer it to the next generation so that more people can come and be part of our guild,
Mm.
and then more people can practice it in the real world,
Mhm.
right? So the first universities in the world, in the early, I think 1200s, like AD, like after,
Mhm.
in that period, like I
Right.
think the University of Paris
Mm.
was a guild for theology.
Okay. Mhm.
Okay, the University of Florence, I think, was a guild for law, or legal studies,
Oh.
and the
Uh-huh.
University of Cambridge was a guild for philosophy.
Okay.
So a guild is basically like a group of expert practitioners of a particular trade. Okay,
Oh.
so that is the basic idea behind this creation of this university. Just a group
Uh-huh.
of people that were really good at it came together and said, we are good at this, and
Mhm.
we have the responsibility to transfer it to the next generation. So
Wow.
that was the
Mhm.
first time they created these universities, and the purpose over there, they had a discussion,
Mhm.
and somehow at that point of time they said, in the first 4 years the student will just learn and observe an expert practitioner of the craft, and they
Oh.
will they will just learn, you know um, this particular subject for 4 years, learn the foundations of it,
Mhm.
and they're not going to be practicing it at all.
Mhm.
Okay, just
Mhm.
observe.
Mm.
And again, this is a very Western perspective, so that is something I also have to, because if you think about it, a lot of our university systems are influenced from, especially in India, from the
Right.
colonial system that
Right.
comes from Britain, pre-independence, and their system was influenced by the European system,
Mhm.
which is
Mhm.
what I'm probably sharing here.
Mhm.
But I can come to the Indian influence again based on my limited understanding in a bit. But um, so they decided to do this. So they said for 4 years, you learn what you have to learn, develop an understanding of the subject. Now, once you finish your 4 years, we'll give you an undergraduate degree, a basic acknowledgement that you are a limited practitioner of this craft. So
Okay.
you can practice theology, philosophy, or legal studies or carpentry
Mhm.
at this particular level.
Mm. Mm.
Okay. Then for 2 years, you have to do an apprenticeship program, which is today the master's program,
Okay. Mhm.
where you get a chance to take your knowledge from your undergraduate time and go and practice it in the real world and get some understanding of how this field can be practiced.
Mhm.
Okay, so people would go out and find ways to study and practice, which became sort of the master's program.
Okay.
And
Uh-huh.
then once you finish your master's, you come back from the real world, and now you go back to the guild and you tell them that I want to study a specific aspect of this field
Mhm.
and change or evolve it to create some sort of new product
Mhm.
that takes the field forward. So
Oh.
some people at this point of time will say, I don't want to do this too much in depth. I have my
Hmm.
master's, I have my undergrad, I'm just going to go practice in the real world,
Mhm.
right? But some people want to study it further. So they decide to study for 3, 4 years the purpose at the end of that 3-4 year period was for them to create a product
Mm-hmm.
that sort of took the field forward or created a new
Forward.
sort of understanding, which in
Mm-hmm.
today's world is an academic paper, a PhD thesis.
Mm-hmm.
Maybe in that time it was some sort of, physical product. I don't know. And then eventually you would get a doctorate degree and you would be part of the guild, which would
Okay.
try
Mm-hmm.
and teach, the next generation what to do. So this was sort of the initial sort of idea of how these universities were sort of. And there was a lecture at the Asiatic Society in Bombay where like one of the administrative staff from the University of Florence actually came, and I
Mm-hmm.
remember having this conversation with him about how the University of Florence was a guild for a particular subject, and he actually acknowledged that that was why it was first formed. And I asked him that, so because of the internet and so many other technologies, don't you think it's fair to say that we should reconsider this basic structure? Like,
Mm-hmm.
why 4 years? And why should that happen immediately after each other? Why can't
Mm-hmm.
people spread it out across their careers?
Mm-hmm.
You take up a year right out of high school, then you take another year up, and then I think the idea at that point of time, Arundhati, was that everyone would choose a career and do the same thing for a long period of time.
Mm-hmm.
But
Yeah. Yeah.
now things have changed, right? People are going to change jobs and careers throughout their lives. So
Mm-hmm.
I think it's fair to say that it's worth re-questioning some of these basic structures and how they run and function in a way.
Yes, yes. So, okay, I mean that's a very interesting point. But then, do you think that learning from the this is a point that I hold, that learning from the internet, you're constantly inundated with a lot of information about so many things, and there are a lot of people who get distracted in that process. They're not able to, actually. If you've read this book, Deep Work by Cal Newport, he makes a good case for deep work. And I feel like if you're constantly inundated with information about so many things, and where you cannot really find out if the source is accurate, actually, the information that's being given to you is accurate, that doesn't facilitate that deep learning. I agree with the point that you do not have to maybe go through so many years of studies, like 4 years and then 2 extra years and all of those. But then the quick learning, the quick learning part of the internet is also something that we need to look at closely, because you can learn skills. You do not know how to cook a cake, you can prepare a cake, and then you can basically go on to the go on to YouTube and learn that, right? And probably you can be a good baker as well. But then when it comes to certain skills that are much more complex in in terms of the depth that they carry, I feel like acquiring something just off of the internet is not enough. So for example, for law, or
Mhm.
for even medical studies, there is an amount of depth that you need
Sure.
so much experience firsthand. You need to
Mhm.
dissect a body, you need to have experience in that. You can't just learn it off of the internet, or you maybe need to shadow someone for that
Sure.
purpose. So things that require so I think we can make a point for technology, basically. For what my thing is, that I acquire a lot of tools and technologies. You can learn a language pretty quickly. You can subscribe to all these, courses on Coursera. But with things like legal studies or medical studies or things that are much more complex, I feel like that model still holds a lot of value. uh, it might not be so good to hear to someone who is not really passionate for that subject, that they have to waste so many years in order to figure out that this is not something that they do not want to do. But
Yep.
then
Yep.
I feel like both these sides need to have a fine balance, where
Sure.
you do
Yeah.
not spend so much time of your life doing just one thing that you eventually figure out that you do not want to do. And also you're not just like the internet, you do not rely on such a quick model that you do not develop the deep work ethic.
Correct.
Yeah, so what are your thoughts on that?
No, that's a great point, Arundhati, and I completely agree. And I'm a big proponent of the formal system because I work in it. I'm an elementary
Yes.
school teacher in like a school. So
Mm-hmm.
I think what you said is absolutely true, right? There are certain professional disciplines: engineering, medical
Mm-hmm.
studies,
Yes.
teaching, legal studies. I think you need a set amount of training to be able
Mm-hmm.
to practice it. And this is why I would say the system hasn't changed much, right?
Mm-hmm.
Because even in all these fields, right, for engineering you go through a 4-year BTech.
Yeah.
For the medical field you go through a 4-year. So you notice the structure is similar
Mm-hmm.
to what we discussed in that
Yes,
previous
that.
conversation, right? For law also you go through like a 5-year, I think, LLB, or like a basic degree, and then you get to practice it at the master's or the doctorate level, depending on how specialized you want to get. So
Mm-hmm.
I think this is not going to change much, right?
Mm-hmm.
That is going to stay the way it is, and I think that is completely fair, because some kinds of jobs, if you don't have that basic training, you're not going to be able to practice it in the real world, right?
Mm-hmm.
You can't like learn surgery off the internet, right? You need
Yes,
to be, and you need to learn it from someone that is also a practitioner in a
exactly.
real context. So
Mm-hmm.
I think that is the tension that is
Mm-hmm.
created between like systems and more different forms of learning. And I think with the internet as well, right? And that I just think that the conversation has to, um we just don't have models of people acquiring complete skill sets and work lives based on something they've acquired from the internet,
Mm-hmm.
right? There are people that may do a course online and get a job related to it and make a life related to it, but we don't hear about it as much because our exposure is largely to people that make it through
Mm-hmm.
a particular path, right?
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
So I think that is also a conversation we need, to sort
Right.
of have and expand on.
Mm-hmm.
Like, are there people that also this conversation about changing careers, right?
Mm-hmm.
I think that is something we need to be more open and understanding about, right?
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Just because somebody chose a particular path, it doesn't mean that they have to stick to it,
They
right?
have.
if
Yeah.
if
Yeah.
if they want to change, is there a way for them to reskill and
Yes.
and develop and move to a new path? And that's where my understanding has shifted significantly,
Mm-hmm.
where
Mm-hmm.
I realized that when I was learning in school, the objective wasn't wrong, because at that point of time they wanted me to get into a really good engineering school,
Mm-hmm.
and that sort of training in high school was really important for me to develop the foundational skills to be doing well in a BTech program.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
But I did not want to be an engineer, which is why that sort of training didn't work out for
Yes.
me, right?
Right.
So I think as parents, as teachers, we need to, especially when students are in high school, right? Because that's the only chance in their life when they get to really experience different disciplines, right?
Mm-hmm.
We need to, I think the really good analogy I have is that of a gardener and a carpenter,
Right.
right?
Mm-hmm.
In high school, in school, we need to create a garden
Mm.
where students have a nourishing and nurturing environment to experience different disciplines,
Okay. Mm-hmm.
right? Rather than telling them that this is a discipline, we're going to carpet and shape you to like to sculpt you to become a perfect model of this particular hero, which
Yes.
is unfortunately sometimes the case, depending on where you come from, what your background is.
Mm. Right.
So, and once students know that this is what they want to do, then they have this incredible opportunity to customize their university experience to align with this particular, initial interest.
Yes.
And the university experience can be customized because the first 2 years are often more open ended,
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
and you can figure out different subjects, different. Then you slowly start specializing, and then you can become um, again, I don't think everyone can figure it out so early in their life,
Yes.
right? Some people take their whole lives to do that. So just being okay with that, letting them do that, but also understanding that this is a constantly evolving conversation and there's no
Right.
fixed definition
Mm.
of learning or education in that sense. So yeah.
No, thank you for bringing that point actually about, how, see, there are two kinds of people who either know that this is what they want to do. And there
Yeah.
are certain factors that go into how they know that they want to do and they stick to it. And they
Correct.
don't only stick to it, but they're also able to contribute something of
Correct.
value
Yeah.
to that. Right.
Correct.
Some of us are just there and we are reaping, we are working in that, but we are not actually contributing. We are just
Correct.
doing it for the sake of our own survival.
True.
That is one thing. Second thing is, okay, you said that, all right, in case they're not able to decide, there should be an opportunity to reskill, which is something
Yeah.
that I completely agree with, because you cannot have those perfect factors in place all the time that will help you decide what you have to do in your life.
Mm.
So that is one thing that should be there. The other thing is that maybe, in order to help them realize what they really want to do, we can make some, we can help, or the education system can actually proactively do things that can sort of nurture that kind of an environment where people
Mm.
tend, they at least figure out what they want to do. I know it's not always going to be perfect. For that, we have option B, reskilling. If you,
Yeah.
in case you want to, quit your job, or give up whatever you have been doing. But to your point, since we're discussing about the education system as well, I think there needs to be a certain level of investment, in terms of, the kind of things that can be added into the curriculum, where people can know, so that, it goes back to our earlier conversation about how you didn't know what you wanted, you didn't know what
Mm.
you liked. So
Mm.
facilitate certain things in such a way that people actually know what they like. And again,
Mm.
I come back to my point, don't make everything standardized so that
Correct.
only the ones who can figure that out gain from it, and others are just left out, and they're made to feel bad. They're actually made to feel bad. There were, students in our class that couldn't perform well because, sometimes it's your neurology, it's the way your brain has been designed, and it's not
Yeah.
something that you have control over. Some people take time. All those people were called dumb by the
Yeah.
teacher in front of everyone, and that's why I call it shitty, because it was so, you can't say that.
Yeah.
Sometimes people
Yeah.
do not understand, some people are very emotional. It depends upon the
Yeah.
kind of organ that their brain, like, people who have a more more developed PFC or prefrontal cortex, they are more rational, they're more logical. People with
Mm.
a bigger amygdala are, fear a lot. So do
Yeah.
you do you really think you can standardize everyone that this is the ideological man,
Yeah.
ideal man,
Yeah.
and this is how you should be? I don't think you can do that. And you call someone dumb just because they've been blessed with a neurocircuitry that's not really, conducive to the kind of
Yeah.
things that you want them to excel at.
Yep.
So I think we can go from a very standardized model to a slightly personalized model. I guess,
Sure.
it might be very expensive to actually cater a program that's catered to everyone, but at least
Correct.
we can make an effort towards that direction, and,
Yeah.
actually help them realize their potential earlier on.
Sure.
If they're not able to do that, then yeah, there should be enough opportunities to reskill. That's where maybe the internet comes in place, where you can learn a skill quickly, and you can, earn really quickly, or do things in order to ensure, and then focus on the long term. So yeah, I
Yeah.
mean, thanks for bringing that point. I mean, this is something that's really interesting.
No, and
um
like
yeah.
what you said, Arundhati, I think which again comes back to our discussion about
Hmm.
how each one of us has something so important to say about learning, right?
Yes. Hmm.
So I think what you said was actually something that is so important
Hmm.
for
Hmm.
anyone that is working in education to understand that.
Right, right.
Uh, and I feel like a lot of that understanding comes from your own experience
Hmm.
as a student in school and university, and you have a significant chunk of your life to actually build these thoughts out of, right? So
Right.
I think it's amazing, and I completely agree with what you said. And
Yes. Yeah, though it is very, I look back, just like talking about this, like, I got reminded of certain incidents at school, where there
yeah,
was this
yeah.
kid who was actually, I'm just narrating this experience just for, there's this kid who had a problem, who had some disorder, some
Hmm.
physiological disorder, and he couldn't perform well in his classes at all.
Right.
And there was this teacher, I remember, who used to give cut sort of give him such a hard time about
Mm.
not being able to perform, whereas he actually generally had a physiological disorder. So maybe his brain function was also impaired because of that, or something was there.
Sure.
Years
Yeah.
later, I come to know that actually he passed away because of that disorder. But I
Wow.
couldn't stop thinking about how that teacher would give him such a hard time for not being able to perform well, instead of catering the curriculum according to his needs. Maybe,
Correct.
attend, give him special time. Not that everyone required special time, he was a special case, but she could have
Yeah.
done that. Or maybe, the school would have made a certain provision for him, for, But yeah, so this
True.
is really sad to know, and this happens
Yeah.
everywhere else, not everywhere, but in a lot of places. So we need to change that. We need to change that. And it's not also fair to bullshit the entire education system. There are a lot of advantages as well, you know. But we need to look at what's wrong and what can be fixed, and
Correct. Yeah.
what's our wiggle room actually, where can we actually
True.
yeah.
True. And I am somebody that, has so much respect for the profession of teaching. And I'm a
Yes.
teacher myself, right? Because I feel like we sometimes don't understand the complexity and the challenge of the
Yeah.
profession, right?
Hmm.
We don't
Yeah.
pay our teachers a significant amount,
No.
even though it is as important a profession as maybe some of the other disciplines, right?
Yeah.
Like if you
Hmm.
think about the pay scale compared to engineering, law, the
Hmm.
medical field, the teaching field is very negligible. And a
Negligible.
lot of our best graduates don't take up teaching careers because they don't see a sustainable long-term career in it.
Hmm.
And
Hmm.
then, we have other questions about why don't we have a good education system? But then, are we even investing enough in,
Hmm. No.
the people that actually run the system? And if you think about it, that even these teachers, they have their own lives, right? They
Hmm.
have a family, they have their own goals, their own
True.
dreams. And if we think, we can get the best quality system without investing
Hmm.
in, high quality training, a good sustainable long-term income for these
Hmm.
teachers, and also constant opportunities to innovate and create in their own sort of discipline, right? Because
Right.
everyone feels they're an expert in education and they come into the classroom and be like, you should do this, you should do
Hmm.
that.
Hmm.
But these teachers have actually spent 2 years trying to understand how to be a good teacher, and now they
Hmm.
come and do it. So I mean, a lot of the things that may not work out are probably contextual. Maybe
Hmm.
they have pressure from their principal or
Hmm.
their administration
Right.
to increase the students grades.
Hmm.
And this is when, situations like this can happen, because there's so much pressure to push the whole class to a higher average.
Yeah.
Somebody may be left out, and that is unfair, because I think, for me, like the theory of self-determination, I don't know the researcher's name, but it's something
Hmm.
I I think that is like a continuum of learning. We
Right.
always start off from a stage of curiosity,
Hmm.
then we go through a phase of competence, and
Hmm.
then we move towards some sort of creation, like a
Hmm.
social
Hmm.
creation. So
Hmm.
that I feel is sort of my, you know philosophy of learning: curiosity, competence, and creation.
Okay. Hmm.
And like if you think about Cal Newport's work, I've read his work for a lot of years.
Hmm.
His sort of I think understanding sort of comes in this stage where a person is reasonably competent and is also able to create, right?
Right. Yes.
That is why they are able to be in that zone of deep work,
Hmm. Hmm.
because they have already moved through a phase of curiosity and competence, and
Yes.
they are able
Hmm.
to focus for a long period of time on a particular task. It's
Hmm.
very hard to make someone that is new to something to move to the deep work stage immediately,
Hmm.
because they just don't have the experience and the neural circuits to be able to process and transform information in the most effective manner.
Right. Right.
And that is why, you need to also think about this beyond the education system.
Right.
Like, the responsibility also falls on you as an individual, right?
Hmm. Yes.
Once you are able to hack and break the system into its fundamental elements, you're able to
Yes.
break a skill into its fundamental elements, can you figure out a way to move from curiosity to competence to creation, right?
Yes.
And people do it in weirdly interesting and fascinating ways. If you think
Yes.
about like young people creating startups,
Hmm.
they understand a problem.
Hmm.
They figure out what is the problem, very curious about it. They realize they have certain skills,
Hmm.
web technology based, that can convert the problem into a technological solution. So
Hmm.
they convert it into something, and they create something of social value, and
Hmm.
then people incentivize them, and then they have more funds to maybe do something else, right? And
Right. Right.
I think it's the same with sports as well. I think because you're a sports person, like Arundhati, you will understand this better,
Hmm.
right?
Yes.
When
Hmm.
you start off shooting, or when you
Hmm.
start off playing table tennis, in the start you are not good at all, right?
Nope.
You're just hitting the ball
Yes.
across the net,
Yeah.
and for somebody to come to you and tell you you're a horrible shooter or a horrible batsman
Yeah.
in your first 2 or 3 months, you think that is fair to the person starting it. No, right? You need
No.
to give the person multiple opportunities to practice that particular thing. Then
Yes.
that's also why we need to, be more appreciative of the value of critical feedback in the right doses.
Mm-hmm.
Because if you
Yes.
get too much critical feedback when you're starting off, right,
Yeah.
which is what I got when I was learning physics chemistry when I was very
Mm-hmm.
early, right? I was
Right.
always told, you are very bad at science, you are very bad
Mm-hmm.
at math. So when I'm in eighth or ninth grade, I'm already so impressionable. I took it in my head
Wow.
that I'm very bad at math.
Yes.
And
Mm-hmm.
that's why a lot of us, refrain from learning some of these things later on
Yes.
in our life. Kyunki I mean, in our early life, we had such negative experiences that
Yeah.
nobody was able to restructure in any way, right? So I think
And
those things are,
hmm.
sorry, go ahead.
And a lot of us lack the awareness to actually know that this has been fixed for life. We tend to
Correct.
carry this on throughout our lives and feel insecure that somehow we are not able to do perform well. It's just
Yeah,
that now the thing is that mud has been shoved onto you that you're finding it impossible to get out and just realize
true.
what your raw talent, your raw intelligence.
That's so
Because
true,
yeah.
Arundhati.
and
And
and I'm
like,
so, yeah, sorry, please continue.
I'm so excited by this conversation. So like you
I'm so
keep
glad.
going, Arundhati. Yeah.
Yeah, I am glad that this conversation poured into it, because this was something that I was gonna touch upon. I'm sure that a lot of factors go into learning process, and I'm glad that you brought the fact that it's also in an individual process. For me, I'd like to start with how, when I started to learn a little about our neural circuitry and how we actually acquire skills, it became easier for me. Just like you, I'll narrate this experience. I was not really good at maths and logical, all of those subjects that required a lot of logical thinking, and I was just told that you're shitty at it,
Yep.
you're so bad at it, just like you. And
Yeah.
my entire life I just started fearing this. uh, Over the time it just materialized in such a way that I thought I was not only bad at maths, but I was bad at just generally everything.
Mm.
And thank God, because I was exposed to the internet, I started learning a lot of things, I started reading a lot of books, and because of that I came to know about this thing called raw talent, your raw
Mm.
intelligence. Raw intelligence, what I like to define it as something like, it's not the society hasn't shoved it mud yet, it's mud yet. And to go back to your earlier example about the Mexican tribe,
Yeah.
they are not taught, they are not made to feel bad about how they run, and that's why they're like most perfect runners, because
Mm.
they're relying on their raw intelligence for that. And
Sure.
someone is not constantly conditioning them to be something, or to reach a particular goal. They
Yeah.
are exploring their running in their own different ways, and better than the others, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
So my understanding of the neural circuitry, just the basic ones that you'll find everywhere, is
Yeah.
how your neurons connect through synapses. There's a myelin sheath that gets wrapped
Mm.
around it as much as you practice that skill more. But then there are more techniques to that, about getting. So Andrew Huberman, I do not know if you are familiar with this guy. He has a Huberman Lab is his channel's name on YouTube, where he actually uncovers how we learn. What is the
Wow.
role of our nervous system in acquiring skills? What is our role?
Mm.
What is the role of the nervous system in our in emotions, and just how we generally act?
Wow.
And when think of that, and even this book, this book by an evolutionary biologist called Robert Sapolsky. The book's name
Okay.
is Behave, and it
Okay.
takes a look at the neurocircuitry of why we behave the way we do. If we are
Mm.
aggressive, if we are too emotional, what parts of the brain are actually involved in that? And I feel
Mm.
like that gives a fair understanding of the, when you, I don't know why, for me, if someone breaks it down for me, if I come to know that these are the components that are actually involved. So if I'm really angry and fearful, but actually my amygdala is involved in that, for some reason it gives me more clarity.
Mm.
And yeah, and I am able to, and then they say that the prefrontal cortex actually helps you mediate those emotions. So there is like
Sure.
these impulsive emotions, And then your prefrontal cortex is the rationalizer, which will say, for
Correct.
example, if I feel angry at you, like Abhishek is not arriving on time, then my prefrontal cortex will be like, maybe he got stuck in the traffic, maybe
Correct.
there's something that helps. So those things, and it helps me better understand my own self, my own behavior. So definitely, if someone is interested in neuroscience and all those things, and looking at neuroscience from an evolutionary standpoint, do check out this book. If you're not much of a reader, then you can definitely check out his lectures on YouTube, the Stanford lectures. So really,
Yeah.
so what I
Yeah.
wanted
I'd
to
love to. I
understand,
mean, if you could
yeah,
send those to me after the
for
chat, I'd
sure,
love to check them out
for
and
sure,
review.
I will. And so what I wanted to understand from you as well was, like, when you teach your students,
Mhm.
uh, are there any techniques that you teach them, these scientific techniques? For example, there's this one example that Andrew gave. So you learn something, you focus on it, and then you take caffeine. Not for advisable for students, but this is one technique that he mentioned, that you take caffeine, that actually tends to make your learning faster. Or
Mm.
we tend to think that learning is a conscious process, that only when you're engaged in something you are learning. But when you actually take rest, or when you're off of that, then your brain is making connections in the background, and that's also when learning is happening, right?
True. True.
So
Yeah.
they say that after learning a particular skill, rest is important. And this has to be like, you're not using social media, you're resting, actually you're looking at, or you're listening to nature sounds or whatever. So these are some techniques that I know of. And from you, I would like to know, what are the techniques that you follow or you teach your
Mm.
students that can help them be better learners, while acquiring a particular skill, if that makes sense
Sure.
to
And
you. Yeah.
yeah, I think you've mentioned a couple of things that are already very important, right? Like sleep, food,
Mm-hmm.
exercise, being in a calm state of mind.
Mm-hmm.
I think all of these do affect your ability to learn really
Mm-hmm.
well, right? Like it's weird, and that but one of my enduring memories of
Mm-hmm.
school is being really sleepy in the first part of the day,
Uh-huh.
and trying to stay awake.
Mm-hmm.
So I don't remember learning much because I was just sleepy, and
Mm-hmm.
that's also because I didn't have a very good sleep schedule. I'd stay up
Mm-hmm.
late and then go to school, and then I would not be able to focus because I didn't get enough sleep. And when you're younger,
Right.
you need about 8 to 9 hours of sleep to be able to sustain. Like function like in a reasonable manner through the day. But most of us don't get enough, right? So and then think about how the school periods are structured, right?
Right.
I
Right.
think I went to a CBSE school in the Middle East.
Mm-hmm.
There were 45-minute slots, one after the other. Okay, and then
Mm.
we had a small 15-minute break, and then we had four more 45-minute
Yes,
slots.
I
Like
remember.
even an adult would not be able to
Mm.
function effectively in that schedule,
Mm.
right? If you think about it, in the office we
Mm.
take 30 minutes, we work really well, and
Mm.
then for 10 minutes maybe we just take a walk, go to the
Mm.
cooler, have a
Mm.
chat. Or we're not even allowed to check social media or something in some schools, right?
Yeah.
Most
Mm.
school, at least the schools I went
Mm.
to, there was no internet. So we were
Same.
just sitting. One class is done, next
Uh-huh.
teacher would come, the
Mm.
next class is done. So I think it's important to understand how the human brain functions, and
Yes.
I'm a big proponent of the science of learning, in terms of
Yes.
understanding how neural circuits are developed, and creating those connections. And again, um, like there are like a lot of neuroscientists that write about learning that I really follow. I can probably like include that, share it with you
Yes.
later. We can include
Yeah.
it in the show notes. But again, the two that you mentioned also, I'd love to review their work. um, but like when we were in teachers college, so I
Mm.
finished a 2-year B.Ed program. One of
Mm.
the courses I took was the psychology of learning, and
Right.
certain psychological strategies that are very effective for learners, right?
Mm-hmm.
So like for instance, memory, like remembering things, um, connecting it to things you already learned,
Yes.
right? That
Mm.
is a very effective strategy to
Mm.
acquire new information, right?
Mm.
Rather than creating new sets in your brain, when
Mm.
you connect it to something you already know, you will be able to remember it and
Retain it. Yeah.
understand it much
Mm.
better, right? So
Yes.
that is like one strategy we are encouraged to adopt with our students,
Mm-hmm.
especially in school, right? You always connect it to what they learned in the previous grade or
Mm-hmm.
what they're going to learn in the next grade, right?
Mm-hmm.
And then also giving them um, an understanding of the interconnectedness of subjects and disciplines, right? You're not learning something in a vacuum. You're learning this, but this is also connected to this other particular discipline,
Hmm.
right? So when you, for instance, from an engineering point of view, or from a, like, if you're building a bridge, right, you also
Yeah.
have to consider the impact on the society living around that
Yes.
particular community.
Mm-hmm.
So different parts of your brain sort of like function to think about a valid solution to that particular problem, right?
Hmm.
So these are two very basic examples. There's actually a very nice PDF that the American Psychological Association has released. I think it's available on the internet, that has like 20 strategies
Mm-hmm.
that teachers can adopt in their class. So I'll just share that with you, Anuruddha,
Please
if you could
do.
include that
Yes. Yep.
in the show notes. These, I think, the two I mentioned were part of
Hmm.
that, but they have
Hmm.
some great examples in that I
Right.
would
Hmm.
also, recommend
Hmm.
highly.
No, this is wonderful. Do send them to me, because I think those strategies might be very diverse and very, it might be time consuming to get into. So
Sure.
Abhishek has rightly pointed out, and I'm going to be pasting that material, and you guys can definitely check that out. Right. So this is so good, because this answers all the questions that I had prepared. You yourself answered them. Just
Yeah.
something, this is how I like the whole conversation to flow.
Yeah.
So Abhishek, you covered the psychological part of it. I also want to understand it from a societal point of view. You mentioned that you have done your bachelor's in arts in psychology, sociology, or
Um,
yeah,
I
this
did it in English literature,
huh,
psychology, and political science.
political
So that,
science. I'm
yeah.
sorry for that. Yeah. So I was talking with my friend the other day, and she was experienced just like how you noticed your niece building these Lego blocks and answer the same thing with different fingers, with a combination of different fingers. She noticed the same thing, and we were talking about that. She was sharing her experience about her nephew and her niece, of how they were playing Jenga and building blocks. And the girls seemed to be following a set of very limited rules.
Mm,
And she wasn't able to be so creative with the way she was building it, and most often she was getting it wrong,
mm,
and in a way that wouldn't actually let actually collapse the building. The guy, on the other hand, was just free spirited and very, just doing any, follow no, not following any sort of rules, and he was just doing it in a way that was much better than how the girl was doing it.
mm,
Now, I do not want to, shame girls for that. I'm not saying that. So my friend and I were like, why is that happening? So I
mm,
asked her, and I was like, what are the roles of the, both these children in the family? So she said that, yeah, actually I noticed that, her mother has this sort of image of her daughter, that she should be proper, she should be all behaving and conforming. And the guy actually has a lot of leverage to do anything that he wants. He's not constrained, and he can behave the way he wants. And there's also the age difference that plays into that. She's elder, she's supposed to be responsible, whereas he's a little like that. So there were a lot of factors that played into that particular behavior that we were sort of trying to analyze. So here's what I want to look at it from that point of view. Do you think that these societal constraints also hinder learning in any way? When this woman actually felt so constrained of following the rules and conforming to them, and there was pressure from her mother as well to be proper and all of that, so that kind of played into her personality, where she was not able to get room for creativity, because she was so focused on following the rules, or those limited set of rules, which were also not right, by the way.
mm.
So, like, could you get into that?
Yeah, yeah, that's another great question, and you ask really, really good questions, and makes you think about a lot of things. But I think that we all contain multitudes, like
Right.
quoting Amit Verma from that other podcast I listened to. But
Uh-huh.
I think if you think about your identity, right, Arundhati,
Hmm.
there
Hmm.
is so many parts of your identity that you have to consider, right?
Hmm.
Your socioeconomic background, right?
Right.
Your nationality, your racial background, your
Hmm.
gender, your sexuality, your professional background, your
Hmm.
educational background, right?
Right. Right.
Every individual has different parts that define these facets of their identity.
Yes.
And in some societies, all, again, it's not like a developed thing. It's valid across contexts, right?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Certain identities are placed on a pedestal in comparison to others, right?
Yes. Mm-hmm.
So certain gender roles are preferred over other, and this is not limiting it to male, female, even
Mm-hmm.
transgender, like thinking about it in a larger spectrum, right?
Mm-hmm.
Also think about this from the notion of socioeconomic background.
Mm-hmm.
Someone that is more well off socioeconomically will
Mm-hmm.
have access to more personal, customized opportunities that are
Yes.
more aligned with their larger goals, right? So even
Mm-hmm.
if you are a bad student, with the support you get, you
Mm-hmm.
will eventually figure out things and make it to, a good, reasonable location eventually, right? Because
Mm-hmm.
you have so much support.
Right.
And even professionally, right? Unconsciously, we place certain careers on a pedestal,
Yeah.
right? Think about that, the impact of that on
Mm-hmm.
a young child trying to understand the world, right?
Mm-hmm.
When we place a career on a pedestal, we immediately associate that with more acceptance. So the
Yes.
kid is like, I should just do that because
Mm-hmm.
when I do that, everyone will think I am the coolest thing in the world. And
Right.
at a young age, we want to be the coolest person in the world. We want to be the
Mm-hmm.
coolest person in our school. We want to be the coolest person in our neighborhood. So that is
Yes.
our objective, right? So to create a safe learning environment,
Mm-hmm.
you know, the parent, and this is something I really want to emphasize, and that the role of the parent is so much more important than the role of the teacher,
Needless
right?
to say,
Because the
yes.
the parent is with that particular kid for a much longer time than a
Mm-hmm.
teacher who will be in
Mm-hmm.
that kid's life for a year at the
Right.
max, right?
Uh-huh. Right.
So I think the parent, the teacher, the friends, the community around an individual
Mm-hmm.
should create a safe space for the person to express whatever facet of identity they associate with, whether
Yes.
it's being male, female, transgender, or any other gender, whether it's
Mm-hmm.
being um, socio-economically well off or
Mm-hmm.
not being so socio, whether it's subscribing to a particular profession that is valued in today's society
Mm-hmm.
or subscribing to uh, another profession that is not as valued, right?
Mm-hmm.
So for instance, in today's economy, somebody that studies um, computer science, would be considered as, wow, you're going to be doing great things in your life, right?
Yes.
And then somebody that studies the arts, like, why are you studying the arts? Like, so that is our first, and unconsciously we have this question, right? If you think
Right.
about, when as soon as I said the arts and engineering,
Mm-hmm.
you're like, you immediately associate the individual with certain economic rewards and
Yes.
success in life, right?
Mm-hmm.
So which is unfortunate, right? And it's
Mm-hmm.
it's it's how society is structured. But I think to create a safe learning environment, we need to let the individual know that
Mm-hmm.
no matter what identity you choose, you are accepted and you can feel safe and you
Right.
are valued and you can contribute. And
Yes.
then once the person knows that they don't have to prove themselves or
Mm-hmm.
judge or are being judged for their value or worth,
Mm-hmm.
then they will figure out which identity they want to move into at any point of time. And I think this is such a vulnerable, um, like fluid space, right, Arundhati?
Mm-hmm.
Because
Mm-hmm.
when we are younger, like what you mentioned about the prefrontal cortex, we
Right.
don't completely develop our prefrontal
Yes.
cortex till we're 27 or
25.
28,
Yeah. 25 or
25.
20. Yeah.
I think in our mid 20s or so, right?
Yes.
So
Yes.
when we're much younger, we often make decisions based on, the on something
So
that we're,
true.
and
So
and
true.
that is not your fault, right? And I
Yes.
think we need to expand the, and this goes back to mental health and so many
Yes.
other things, right, Arundhati? Like when we meet somebody,
Mm-hmm.
rather than judging them for doing what they did, we need to ask them, what were the experiences that led you to
Hmm.
doing this particular thing,
Right.
and then understand it from that perspective rather than questioning why they
Question.
did what they
Why do?
did without.
Yeah.
So I feel like we can do this as educators,
Hmm.
but we also need to do this as friends and family with
Yes.
the people
Exactly.
in our community. If
Yes.
somebody in your circle is doing something, encourage them,
Hmm.
ask them why they're doing it,
Hmm.
understand where that curiosity comes from,
Hmm.
and support them. If they like something, send them an article related to what they're doing, send
Yeah.
them a video.
Hmm.
And I feel like that is the basic tenet of a encouraging, nourishing learning environment, you know?
So good. This is so wonderful. You put it so eloquently. And this is something, these conversations, and how just the simple thing of just supporting the others, supporting other people in their endeavors, can
Yeah.
go a long way into shaping their narrative for themselves, of how they view themselves. Very good point how you brought up about PFC and how it's not developed until you're 25. So the decisions that you're taking are based the first of all, you're not capable of making rational decisions for yourself, so you rely on these authority figures, your parents, your teachers. And if your parents or your teachers fail to do a good job, you are sort of stuck with those very limited abilities or your limited view about yourself for the rest of your life. There
True,
are certain
true.
people, for the rest of those who figure a way out, lucky for them, good for them. But there
Yep.
are a lot of people who get stuck in the same patterns, whether it's sexual patterns, whether it's emotional patterns, or even patterns related to learning abilities. They get
Correct. Yeah.
stuck with
And
that.
just
But
just to like
yes,
interrupt you there, it's because you
no
made such a
problem.
great point. And
Yes.
like one of the experiences that I value a lot during the
Hmm.
gap year
Hmm.
was this little community I built. I didn't I we co-created it. So,
Yeah. Uh-huh.
there were a couple of us that were interested in different disciplines. Okay.
Hmm. Hmm.
And I was very passionate about learning experiments, and
Hmm.
that could be a different conversation. I used to just hack, like go to every conference, every seminar,
Hmm.
every festival, like
Hmm.
in Bombay, because the city is a great learning
Right.
like landscape as well. I think that
Uh-huh.
can be like a different conversation. But
Hmm.
there was this group called the Algonquin Roundtable, okay, in the
Okay.
1940s, 1950s in New York. They
Hmm.
were a group of writers that were writing about different issues, but
Hmm.
they said it would be nice to create a group where we could meet up and
Hmm.
discuss how we are practicing. And our only
Right.
objective in this meeting is to
Hmm.
get the other person excited about what we are doing.
Uh-huh. Yes.
So, I had a group of friends in Bombay who
Hmm.
were all doing different things. One
Hmm.
was, I think, a UX designer.
Uh-huh.
And I think I can say their names because I think their influence on my life has been huge. So,
Yeah.
King Siddharth, he used to work for a company, and I used to work for Instamojo, and now he's working.
Hmm.
I think he is somebody who's thinking I am really influenced by. There was Kiran,
Hmm.
Raj, Jatan. Like Jatan is someone I want to talk about, right? He's also on
Hmm.
my podcast, Learning Stories. He's the first person I interviewed.
Yes. Yeah, I
So
saw that. Hmm.
Jatan did his bachelor's in physics and his
Uh-huh.
master's in physics. And then he decided to work for Team Indus in Bangalore as
Hmm.
their space communication writer. And
Hmm.
now he writes this really amazing newsletter
Hmm.
on any scientific development related to the moon. Okay.
Oh.
And
Uh-huh.
so he is somebody that changed my thinking about science, right?
Right. Uh-huh.
Because my association with science was so negative.
Hmm.
When I met Jatin,
Hmm.
the only thing he talked about was how fascinating science was. So he gave me a
Yeah.
book by Richard Feynman,
Richard
and
Feynman. I was gonna mention
and
that.
Feynman is so amazing because the way
Yeah.
he talks about science, I think it's surely you're joking, Mr.
Yes.
Feynman.
Yeah.
I read that book, amazing. He recommended this book about like a space exploration mission to
Hmm.
the moon called
Hmm.
Chasing New Horizons.
Okay.
That
Hmm.
was the best nonfiction book I've read in a long time,
Hmm.
because it talks about how an idea of sending like a satellite to the moon, I mean,
Hmm.
to Pluto,
Hmm.
was conceptualized and actually implemented. And, I am such a big science buff now, Arundhati. So, yeah,
Oh.
and I am comparing this to the child I was in grade eight, right?
Mm-hmm.
I love, the periodic table. I love everything about physics, how
Hmm.
everything can be, broken down to these basic elements.
Right.
Um,
Uh-huh.
so I'm reading as much as I can about science, and I'm so genuinely passionate about it, though I'm not practicing it. So this was
Yes.
just one story I wanted to share about how a very negative sort
Hmm.
of association with a subject changed completely because I was aware it was negative, but also started associating with people that were giving me more positive impressions of it.
Yes. Uh-huh.
And then I slowly took myself from curiosity
Hmm.
to competence, where I started reading books about scientific topics related to things I would
Hmm.
be interested in, like
Right.
Feynman, space exploration. And slowly I am in this competence stage where science is more accessible and
Hmm.
more fun. And then I don't, it's fine. I don't care if I don't become a scientist, but
Yes.
science is not only for scientists, right?
Yeah.
Mathematics is not only for mathematicians.
Yes.
Mathematics is English literature is not
Mm-hmm.
only for English professors, right?
Mm-hmm.
So this is just, like one story I wanted to share about how, with personal awareness, you can change this fixed mindset you have about your ability in certain things and move
Right.
towards like a growth mindset, which is again one of the psychological strategies that we were recommended in teachers college as well, like push kids to realizing that your ability is never fixed. You can
Mm-hmm.
always
Yes.
grow in a sense.
Yeah. No,
So
you made a very interesting point about, learning disciplines, even when you're not required to. You don't want to be a scientist. Even then, you want to explore the world of science.
yeah,
And this guy, Jatin, has made it so much more accessible to you that you have actually begun to appreciate science for what it is and not hate it as a subject. You
yeah,
know, so I feel like this inter or cross disciplinary learning is also something that we can facilitate. We can maybe allow our kids or encourage our kids to actually learn something that they're just curious about, and not just restrict themselves to books or to the syllabus that is given by the school. Right? Maybe you read up, maybe you can have a session that you read up about something that you're interested about. Probably you read up about North Korea. Okay, come
yeah,
and share your insights. I know you're not going to be a politician, but just share your insights. So sometimes I feel like this cross disciplinary learning, this helps you in your discipline also, because you're not only restricting yourself to one subject, you're drawing inspirations from others as well. And I
true,
think I
true.
came across this when I was there was someone who was speaking about Charles Darwin, and how he opened so many multiple subjects, and then he would read them, read some from one and then leave it, and then read some from the other. So there was like cross disciplinary communication. And based on what they were able to actually develop really good ideas.
Mm,
So that is one thing that thank you for bringing up that point, because that's really interesting. Don't just limit yourself to one particular subject. Try to sort of set up that connection with other subjects as well. Maybe you learn something, maybe you'll make a connection, your brain will make the connection. I love the powerful of sorry I love how powerful our brains are, that
yeah,
how you just need to give it the right input in the right ways, and it's going to make every connection itself by itself. It's just so powerful, and us realizing that is powerful enough for us to learn something. That's the only thing. So uh, you know so that is so great. This is a very interesting conversation. I think I wish I could go on about it. Maybe we'll take it offline, but yes,
yeah.
do share those resources that you've come across. Do share those papers. um, so Abhishek, just before we close this, I'd like to get into this a little about your work experience. I was going through your LinkedIn profile, and there's this particular work experience that I noticed, that I'd like to know more about. When you were a researcher at Western University, you
Yeah.
mentioned you worked with this project called Surviving Memory in post-war El Salvador.
Mm,
It was a collaborative research initiative. uh, it was international. It was an international partnership of survivors, scholars, artists, lawyers, museums, architects, community organizers, and municipal governments. So talk a little more about this project, and what insights you gained on this, and educate us a bit about what actually happened here.
yeah, yeah. I mean, this was also something that I came across when I was a student at university. I mean, I went back to teachers college at a university in London, Ontario, called
Yeah.
Western University.
Hmm.
And I mean, it's not the London in the UK. It's about 2 hours from Toronto here in Canada, in the province of Ontario. So I was looking out for opportunities in terms of like a summer internship that I could do in addition to my program as an
Hmm.
additional source of
Hmm.
income. And I came across this project, and it's run by a wonderful professor, Amanda Gibb,
Hmm.
um, who works in the media school here at Western University. And there was a civil war that happened in El Salvador from 1980
Hmm.
to 1992.
1980 to
And
1992. Yes.
yeah, and during the civil war, there was a lot of conflict between the government and the population that lived there. and there were a lot of unfortunate massacres and situations that were not, very ideal.
Hmm.
And there was no way to record the perspective of the people that were affected by the civil war, right?
Oh. Uh-huh.
Because there wasn't as much media, or there was a lot of censorship by the government at that point of time. And this was also one of the proxy wars that the US fought after the
Hmm.
Vietnam War in the 60s.
Oh, okay.
So, like, this was like their next big project. And this is just something, like, even I did not know about it. And it's
Hmm.
something I was trying to understand better. So, the project basically tries to look at creating artifacts related to the perspective of the survivors
Hmm.
that will document their experience in the war,
Hmm.
so that the war doesn't happen again in the future.
Oh,
So there
okay.
was like a musician in the who was affected by one of these incidents.
Hmm.
He created music related to his experience of moving as a refugee
Hmm.
to Guatemala, which
Hmm.
was close to El Salvador at that point of time. And I think we made a short. I think the project made a short film about that musician
Hmm.
and his songs in their local language. So, and it's just, I mean, it recently got a Shirke grant, which is like this organization that gives
Hmm.
grants to research projects.
Okay.
So it got like a 2 million grant to take that forward. I'm not associated with the group again because
Hmm.
I recently started a new role.
Hmm.
uh, but I think it's amazing. I can send you a link of their website, and
Hmm.
they're doing some wonderful work. And yeah, this was just, again, it's just this idea of having a very fluid understanding of your career, right? So when I
Right.
began my career, I was actually not a school teacher. I was a
Hmm.
research associate at an IB school in India called the American School of Bombay. And then
Hmm.
we, once we were done with that, we formed like a small startup nonprofit organization called Consilience.
Yes.
And I was with them for about 2 years in Bombay. And
Hmm.
before that, I also, dabbled in the UX world for like a couple of months. And I was also, um, doing different sorts of jobs
Hmm.
before I finally settled into teaching, right? And
Right.
um, yeah, and that's just like a little background, like, about my
Right.
professional journey. And
Uh-huh.
right now I work as a elementary teacher at a
Hmm.
school in Mississauga in Ontario. So that's where I'm at in my life right now.
That's so interesting. So, what apart from work, what is it? Discuss a little about your hobbies, anything that you like to, your guilty pleasures, anything. W- What about them?
um, I'd say it comes down to sports, movies,
Mm-hmm.
and books. These
Mm-hmm.
are three things I'm very passionate about. I
Mm-hmm.
think I'm particularly passionate about reading nonfiction, like narrative nonfiction.
Uh-huh.
So, like a couple of books I've really enjoyed, like Chasing New Horizons, the Romanovs,
Mm-hmm.
which is like historical nonfiction, and yeah, those were two I'd recommend. I love watching movies.
Mm-hmm.
I'm like a big movie buff, and movies from all cultures and all
Right.
genres.
Uh-huh.
So I have like a letterboxd account that I
Mm-hmm.
constantly update, that I really, really am passionate about. And then sports, I just enjoy. I feel like sports is a great metaphor for life in terms of,
Yes.
like how, for
Everything.
instance, I think running can be like a metaphor for life, right? Because you have to compare yourself to your previous run. And
Mm.
even like if you do weights, for instance, you're applying progressive pressure on
Progressive.
your
Yes.
like maximum ability, right? I mean, and that's the thing you do even in your professional field, right? You try
Mm.
to apply, like, work at your level of scaffold or
Yeah.
something. So
Yes.
so I think like these are three things I'm very passionate about on the
Mm-hmm.
side.
Mm-hmm. So any recent movies that you watched, international movies that you watched that moved you? For me, I took this 15-day leave and I only watched German and French movies, like post-war and German Nazi movies or French romantic movies, and I found them very profound, so profound. And it's like I should have watched this before, and I'm still searching for a lot of other movies of these different cultures. So, is there
Yeah.
anything interesting that you might have watched recently? Or any time all time favorite of yours that you would recommend people?
Um, yeah, it's a great question. I like anything by Richard Linklater. The Before
Anything.
Sunrise series.
Hmm.
I really enjoyed watching that. I watch a lot of documentaries. Um, I think there's one about Searching for Sugar Man is a really nice documentary. It's about this South African musician. No, it's
Hmm.
about this American musician who was apparently only popular in South Africa at one point of time and nowhere else, and
Oh.
then
Uh,
he decided to not be a musician. And but then he eventually they found him out again, and
hmm.
they realized that he has a following in South Africa or something like that. So
Hmm.
I think yeah, these were just two recommendations off the top of my head. But if you
Right.
are on Letterboxd, which is
Letterbox.
like a community for film watchers, I'd love to connect over there and share more movies.
Yeah, that's what I immediately thought after you mentioned it. Like, okay, gotta sign up to Letterbox now.
Yeah.
Yes. Apart from that, you have your passion project, your podcast, learning stories. Get into a little bit about why you thought about starting it. What made you, because I remember that this gap year played a huge role in, sort of getting you to learn more about people, because that's one thing that you, always believed in, that people have a lot more to offer to you than you might think. So, how, learning stories was, I guess, in line with that belief of yours. So, talk to us about, learning stories and why you decided to start a podcast.
Sure, yeah, and like that's a question I feel really strongly about as well.
Hmm.
And that, I
Hmm.
think there are two things I identify with in terms of my professional identity. One is
Hmm.
that of being a teacher, but
Hmm.
the other part is being an educational researcher.
Hmm.
And it's also not being an educational researcher in the very traditional sense of what it means to be a researcher. So I did a master's degree in education,
Hmm.
and my thesis was on school mission statements in a
Hmm.
CBSE school.
Right.
Um, but I always thought that in education research, we always study, the subjects that are within the system at a particular point of time,
Yes.
right? But I was just going back to this idea of all of us have some experience in the education system.
Hmm.
Can we find a way to document the experience of different people
Hmm.
in an effective manner that is engaging,
Hmm.
but also helps us understand what worked for them and what didn't work for them, right?
Yes.
So,
Hmm.
and like just I mean the conversation we're having today, right, and that there is so much that will be of value to
Hmm.
someone that is a teacher,
Hmm.
because they realize that if both of us were students in their classroom, maybe these things would work for us and these things would
Hmm.
not work for us. So that was the motivation behind learning stories. Like in the show, I just profile individuals who are doing interesting things with their life, and I try to understand how they got to that particular point in their lives, and it's just a very free flowing conversation. I mean,
Yes.
just like Primate Talks. So if you ever want to, listen to one of the episodes, it's on most, streaming platforms,
Hmm.
and it's called Learning Stories. So I hope you get a chance to
Yes, it's
listen
a
to it
very
someday.
interesting podcast. I definitely can vouch for that. And it was the motivation behind why I called Abhishek Shetty to Primate Talk, because I was so in love with his clarity on things, the way he speaks, the way he talks, gets so many points into the conversation and give you such a holistic view of things. So that was definitely something that I loved. So, Abhishek, before we conclude, if you were to summarize learning in an elevator pitch, how would that sound like?
That's that's very hard. That's something I wouldn't um, like. I don't know. There's no like fixed definition of learning, but I'd say that everyone has their own understanding of learning, and to associate it with another like concept, I'd say learning is fun, learning is beautiful,
Yes.
learning is what you think learning is, right? So find your own understanding of learning and define it in a way that seems most appropriate to you.
Yes, that was really powerful. Abhishek, I thank you a lot for coming on to the podcast. I know we decided to do it a long time, and I'm so glad that you followed up. I'm so glad you came back. And this has been one of the most interesting podcasts that I've done. So many insights. I'm gonna rewatch it. I'm gonna pick all those materials that you referred to, and definitely gonna go through them, because I'm so interested in sort of following up on whatever you just told us. It has definitely been insightful, and nothing short of extraordinary. It was amazing talking to you. Yeah, so yep. See you soon, and I hope we
Thanks.
can share more of our insights in subsequent podcasts. So please do come back. And yes, hope to see you again. All right.
Thanks, Anne.
Okay. Goodbye, everybody.